this iteration of Coffee and Collaboration. If you want to go ahead and put your name and the organization you're from in the chat box, that'll be great. Then we know who all's here. And if you haven't already, you want to go ahead and mute yourself so we don't hear your kitties and dogs barking in the background or whatever else you've got going on. That'll be great. And just a reminder that we will be recording this session. So we're not going to record the breakout portion, but the presentation and the question and answer will be recorded. So if you haven't joined us for one of these presentations and events before, just want to let you know that the purpose of these is to give us a chance to bring people from all different organizations across Colorado together to discuss relevant and important topics that are things we can all hopefully use in our own organizations. Today, we're talking about multilingual programs, and we've got a couple of really great speakers who are going to share some helpful information for us. I think this is a topic that we all know is maybe something that is missing a little bit in a lot of our programs and is something a lot of us are starting to prioritize more and more. So I'm really excited to hear what Anna Stout from Royce Hurst and Christine Clay from Dumb Friends League are going to share with us. We're also going to have time for questions, and then we'll be breaking out into groups to talk and share things that have worked, things that we're struggling with, and if we have resources that are going to be helpful going forward. Also, just wanted to remind you that the next dates in this series are on August 4th and November 3rd. So I think that's it. If you guys want to go ahead and take it away with the presentation, we're very excited to hear
I'm going to introduce them.
Oh, yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Anna. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. If you think it's a coincidence that we're talking about multilingual programming on Cinco de Mayo, we're not. When our collaboration committee realized our next Coffee and Collaboration fell on this holiday, it started kind of jogging us to think about what sort of a topic we might talk about on Cinco de Mayo. And we landed on something that's very important, multilingual programming. So we're very excited to have a couple of great presenters today, and I'm going to do some quick bios for our presenters. Our first presenter is Christine Clay. Christine has worked in community outreach for the Dumb Friends League for nearly 7 years. She started with the mobile spay-neuter program and currently serves as the coordinator of Healthy Pet Services for Solutions Veterinary Hospital. Her program provides low-cost vaccines, spay-neuter, behavior consults, and pet supplies to priority neighborhoods in Denver and Aurora. The program serves a predominantly Spanish-speaking population. Christine began learning Spanish 8 years ago in order to better communicate with and support her clients. Our other presenter today is Anna Stout. Anna is the CEO of the Royce Hurst Humane Society based in Grand Junction with a satellite shelter in Delta. She has 17 years of nonprofit and business experience and has served on state and national level boards and committees for issues ranging from language access to animal welfare. She currently sits on the Animal Welfare Association of Colorado Board of Directors and is co-chair of the Advocacy Committee. She is the past co-chair of the Colorado Association of Professional Interpreters. As executive director at Royce Hurst, Anna has focused much of her effort on building and strengthening local and regional collaborative relationships with animal and non-animal welfare agencies, especially as they relate to the role of companion and shelter pets in improving human and community health. Anna is a certified court interpreter, ATA certified translator from Spanish to English, former certified medical interpreter, and owns Transfinim Language and Cultural Services, a translation and cultural consulting business. She has worked extensively within the legal and medical fields and with Spanish-speaking populations throughout the state, including as an upper division Spanish instructor at Colorado Mesa University and as an interpreter trainer throughout the Western Slope. She has presented nationally on issues including cultural continuums and works with businesses and organizations to ensure their multilingual messaging is culturally and linguistically informed. Anna has a master's degree in global affairs with an emphasis on organizational leadership from the University of Denver and a bachelor's in Spanish literature and language and applied professional Spanish with a minor in international relations from Colorado Mesa University. So with that, I will kick it over to Christine and Anna to talk to us about multilingual programming.
Thanks, Sarah. And Rachel, can you start sharing the presentation now? So good morning, everyone. It's our pleasure to be here presenting with you today, and we're really excited about the opportunity to really kick off this conversation. When Christine and I were talking about this, we really acknowledge that this is a starting point for everyone and for this conversation. So what we're hoping that everyone walks away from this morning's presentation with is a couple of concrete starting points and an awareness of a couple of the pitfalls. So Rachel, are you going to share it, or do you want me to share the presentation?
It's
if you want to
shared,
just
Anna.
say,
Oh, I can't, oh goodness, all I can see is everybody's faces, so perfect. Now I can see the presentation. Great. So I'm going to let Christine kick us off about really why this is important. We'll talk a little bit about some of the efforts at our respective organizations, and then we'll get into the concrete how-tos.
Hey, thanks, Anna. This is Christine. My video intermittently does or does not work, so bear with me. Hopefully you can at least hear me, but let me know if the audio is not coming through. As Sarah said, I am the coordinator essentially for our wellness services through the Dumb Friends League, through our low-cost veterinary hospital. Our wellness program in its current iteration was created in 2018 to support pet owners that have limited access to veterinary resources. And we do currently focus our resources in 8 different neighborhoods in Denver and Aurora, providing spay-neuter, vaccines, behavior consults, pet supplies, pretty much everything across the wellness spectrum that we can. I have spent a good portion of my time with the Dumb Friends League kind of on the actual streets, working in the community with the folks. And I have encountered and tried to communicate with people in lots of different languages, not only Spanish, but I've encountered folks that I've been speaking Russian, Vietnamese, and certainly I'm sure other languages that I never was able to sort out. And I would say anecdotally, the majority of people that come to our vaccine clinics that we do are Spanish speaking. So the majority of the folks I interact with out in the community are Spanish speaking. My goal over the past few years at the Dumb Friends League really has been to create an environment that provides more access to our non-English speaking patrons. And currently at the Dumb Friends League, what our main focus is, we do make sure all of our public-facing signage is bilingual. We are really working to push and recruit more bilingual speakers for different positions. We're currently working on putting in a multilingual tool into our website so patrons can access the information in different languages. But with all of that, I always feel like we can all do more. If we want to accomplish our missions, which I think for most of us is to reduce relinquishment and to reduce animal suffering for all pets, then I really think we need to be able to speak to all pet owners. At my time at DFL, I have heard from coworkers who have struggled to support patrons in other languages that were there for an adoption or there for a higher stress issue, like a relinquishment or a euthanasia. And in each of those instances, for the person, there was this feeling of frustration and concern related to the uncertainty about the efficacy and quality of the interaction. And in one case, a patron was actually asked to return and come back in a different time when Spanish-speaking staff would be available. So my impression from working with some community, or my approach is, we obviously cannot be fluent in every language, but I think we as organizations have to have a proactive plan in place to support all these owners. I think it's essential to serving our community, to serving their pets, to accomplishing the mission. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the extremely well qualified Anna to talk about what that looks like to have a proactive plan in place. So thank you so much for letting us be a part of the day today.
Thank you. And Rachel, I think we can sort of skip this slide because I think we just covered that. And then I'll just quickly say that the Animal Resource Center at Roycehurst, we created it in 2016, thinking that we were just, needing to provide behavior support. In 2018, we decided to hire an actual human social worker to come in and make sure that we were meeting human needs. And really that has blossomed from there into our understanding of the Animal Resource Center being a piece of our interaction with the Spanish-speaking community, primarily when we talk about our non-English dominant speakers. And that mostly is happening right now through what's called the Clifton Community Transformation Group. Clifton is one of the lowest income, most disadvantaged communities in Western Colorado, at least in the Grand Valley area. And it's really taking a social capital or social determinants of health approach to how we improve the entire community. And so Roycehurst has pushed really hard to have animals be a part of that. And part of that has required us to look at how we're serving Spanish speakers. Next slide, Rachel. So the real question is, how do I start this process? I think everybody on here is probably in a different iteration of their multilingual programming approach. Some people are here on this call, I'm sure, because you have nothing yet and you want to get started. Some people have some things translated, some people have bilingual staff, and really are just thinking, how do we make sure we do this holistically and comprehensively? And I think that the answer to this question essentially is it depends. It depends on your organization, it depends on your community, it depends on what services you provide. And I think to a lesser extent, though, a real one for nonprofits, it depends on how much you can afford. It depends on what your budget is for meeting some of these needs. I think our argument this morning, though, is that as we're moving forward, we should be providing in our budget for this kind of language focus. So let's start, next slide, Rachel. Let's start with the basic first steps that you can do. And the first one is called a language audit. And this can be either very comprehensive, a multi-page document, or it can be just a matter of sitting down and making a list of what you know and who you need to reach out to get the information that you don't yet have. So what are the non-language English or non-English languages in your community? If you don't have a high concentration of Quora speakers, obviously there's no reason to spend a lot of money translating everything into Quora. But if you know that your community is like largely Spanish speaking for your lots, your languages other than your languages other than English, then you are probably going to look at how many of these languages do we have, and which of those other languages tend to be bilingual or monolingual speakers. For example, if you have a large immigrant community, but they're immigrants that are coming from European countries, they're in, let's say German speakers. German speakers are typically not monolingual German speakers. So you probably don't need to spend a ton of money or put a lot of effort into translating everything into German when you look at that community and realize that that community largely speaks English as well. But for other populations, like potentially the Vietnamese population, or over here in Western Colorado, the Spanish-speaking population, there's not as high an instance of that bilingualism, with English being the second or subsequent language. So that's where you might need to invest some resources. So really look at what your community looks like. And then within those subgroups, or within those groups, are there linguistic subgroups. So for example, in the Roaring Fork Valley, Spanish is one of the highly spoken languages, but it's not a monolith. There's a population in the Basalt El Jebel area that's from El Salvador. There are a lot of people from Mexico and Western Colorado. So it's really a matter of figuring out what linguistic subgroups people belong to, because if you're talking about doing a culturally appropriate or linguistically appropriate translation or language service, you need to make sure that you're speaking their language literally and deeper than just the linguistic language. And then how large are those populations? We kind of talked about that. Then as you're auditing your organization from a language standpoint, it's trying to figure out what the key points of interaction are when people are communicating with your organization. So if you have if the main thing that people are using to interact with your organization is internet-based, figuring out if those speaker groups that you identified as being monolingual and larger groups are those means of communication that they tend to use. For example, if you are an organization that uses a lot of Instagram and Twitter to push your information out, that may not be a way that you're going to reach and that you're actually receiving information back from. That might not be a great way to reach all of the populations that you might want to be communicating to. So really part of this is once you identify that population, it's getting to know that population and finding out what are the means of communication that they tend to use. So Facebook is here in Western Colorado with our Spanish speaking population. Facebook is a popular tool. So if we expect to have that interaction happening, we need to make sure that we have the ability to respond to things and to push information out in Spanish, for example. And also think about, are there socioeconomic factors that impact a certain speaker group? So coming back to this question of internet. So if you're requiring everybody, if that first point of interaction with you is an interest forum on your website, you can put everything you want to in Spanish, let's say, but if you're dealing with a population that does not traditionally have access to the internet for socioeconomic factors, that probably an internet-based, you can put everything in Spanish that you want, but if they don't have access to your website because they don't have access to the internet, or at least not easy access to the internet, it probably doesn't matter how much you put into their language. Next slide, Rachel. So the next thing you're looking at when you're doing this audit of your organization and what language services you need is look at your programs and do a program demand assessment. What are the programs that the populations that are in your community that you want to be sure to serve? What are the programs that they could potentially be accessing, and what are the ones that they are either most likely to or would be most critical for them to have access to, or what's going to have the biggest impact on that community or on your entire community for those language groups that you identified. So I put some examples up here of programs that many of us have. So being able to go through here and say, okay, this is our general list of programs. We're going to rank these. And we think that based on our conversations with people who are connected to this community, probably adoptions, that's not going to be our highest demand. Why? Because maybe there's a prevailing cultural belief in this culture or in this linguistic subgroup that you can get animals you get them from friends, or you get them from, I don't know, Facebook or Craigslist, or from within your in-group. So maybe adoptions isn't the place that it's going to be the most critical, the most utilized, or the most impactful. But when you come to something like resources and education, maybe that's the critical first piece. Maybe people in that community, there's a cultural root for them in not going to shelters. Maybe the home country that they come from doesn't really have the concept of animal shelters as adoption hubs. So perhaps you want to focus on that education about what you do or resources. You can put all the information you want to about how to access your free spay-neuter services, but if the education or the cultural attitude in that community isn't, doesn't tend to do spay-neuter, then it doesn't really help to make those things available in that other language until you do some work on some of the assumptions or some of the education. There are some cultural attitudes that, for example, we do a spay and neuter campaign annually, pre-COVID at least, in El Salvador, and I do spay and neuter campaigns around Mexico. And there's a fair amount of education we do before those campaigns because there are still some pretty serious cultural attitudes about spay and neuter, either from a religious perspective or from a machismo perspective. So make sure that you're ranking these based on, you know, the priority for that community and the impact, but also if there is something that needs to happen before something else, then you'll want to think about what order you take those in. Next slide, Rachel. And then when you've done your language audit and you figured out, okay, these are the languages and the linguistic subgroups in our community. These are the largest ones. These are the ones that we're going to start with. Then you look at, okay, here's our organization. This is what we want to make accessible. These are the programs that we want to prioritize. Then you're going to create a plan of action. And what's really important to think about is if you're starting out or you're in the early stages of having a bilingual organization or a multilingual organization, you can't translate everything at once. I will tell you from just a financial perspective, just translating a standard website is going to be a couple $1,000s if you want every single page done. So rather than, you know, thinking you're just going to put everything into whatever language is prevalent in your community and then you're done, you can make an action plan that really gives you a plan of attack for how you do this in a bite-sized way. So first of all, you start out with which programs and points of interaction should be linguistically acceptable or accessible, sorry. What's the subpopulation that you're targeting? Just like when you're advertising to your English-speaking community, you're not just doing a broad, well, hopefully you're not just doing a broad marketing plan, right? There, you're just kind of like, we're going to send all the information out to everybody in the exact same format. When we look at any kind of messaging, we're looking at who are we speaking to? Who is is there a geographic area? Is there an education level? Is there an age level? Am I trying to communicate to somebody who has access to technology or who doesn't? So really dialing that down. If you're looking at doing something in Spanish, but you want to do it if you want to message it towards a population that is families. So let's say you really want to do adoption messaging. You want to help people understand that they can come down and adopt an animal for you, and here's everything that's in that package. Maybe you're going to focus that on like 30s to 50s age groups so that you're targeting sort of families. Maybe you're going to do it for a senior population, but all of that is part of what goes into what you decide that you're translating or not, or that you're making accessible or not. Don't forget about those cultural attitudes and assumptions that might come into play. And then really think it through. If all you're doing is the entry point, so for example, if you're putting all of your resources online in that language and you've got your signs up in that language, are you dead ending them once they actually come in for services? For, you know, as an example, if I go onto the website and it says, here's all this information about how to adopt an animal or how to access the free spay neuter services, and then that person comes in for those services and there's nobody who can communicate with them, or the actual intake forms are not in their language, or the discharge forms are not in their language, then really what was the point of asking them to come in and advertising it to them? So making sure that you've got a start to finish access process. And that may mean that you're going to focus on one program and make the entire thing linguistically accessible. You're going to wait on the other programs until you have that done. And then from there, you prioritize and budget for that. It's really important to keep in mind that if you translate it, they will come. That's not a language access plan. So really figuring out where the first stop is for some linguistic subgroups. If that's not your website, and if that's walk-in, then where do you prioritize those resources? Maybe it's not having forms in Spanish. Maybe it's having a person who speaks Spanish or whatever language is predominant to be able to help that customer through. So then I have on the next slide, I have an example of what this might look like. So this is just kind of a sample, and these are completely made up. This was just for a made up series of communities. But this is something that you can use to kind of really look at how you prioritize. So looking at an adoptions program, what are my key access points? Where is it that people interact with this? On my website or walking in? who is the language group in my community? It's Spanish, but what's the linguistic subgroup? Mexican and Honduran speakers. Okay, I'll keep that in mind because not all of the words that I'm going to translate are going to be, I'm going to need to figure out how I make this culturally appropriate and linguistically appropriate for both groups. I'm going to target those 30s to 60s, middle income people. I'm really not targeting this at my, my super high income Spanish speaking residents. And then looking at all of these things, okay, then what are my language service needs? I need to make sure that if the website is my key access point, those adoptable pets pages are translated, the adoption process, any adoption forms are translated. And then I'm going to need a full-time employee if this is a major program of mine who is bilingual, who can do customer service. But you know what? Adoptions aren't the number one thing that we really want to get out to our community, so I'm going to make this a second level priority. But surrenders are a big thing. This is another program. These are happening primarily with walk-ins, especially with this community that we're looking at working with. So let's say this is, I'm in a community with a lot of Spanish and Vietnamese. It's Mexican Spanish, the Hanoi dialect in Vietnam. And I'm really looking at how do I serve my low-income population of these Spanish and Vietnamese speakers. Well, if I assess that, I don't really need to hire a whole personnel person for my surrenders because I can borrow from the adoptions team as needed. And the documents that I need are these ones, etc. And that would be, let's say, my number one priority. So you can look at all of your programs, look at who you're targeting. And of course, when you're doing this for your own organization, this language group and linguistic subgroup are likely to be pretty uniform down the middle because you're in your community, you're serving that same population. Now, if you're in Aurora, you're in one of the most linguistically diverse cities in the United States. So you're probably going to have a lot more of these linguistic subgroups, and this is going to be a much more complex chart that you're filling out. But then this gives you an ability to look at what service needs you want to either make bilingual or whatever. Now, one thing I wanted to point out is that in some cases, you can be looking at having a contract interpreter come in. So rather than if you're having a hard time finding a bilingual person, or you just don't have you only have, a non-English speaker accessing your services very infrequently, and the community that you're serving is a very small percentage of your community, maybe you want to just contract with an interpreter to be available to come in when you have those, those one-off needs. And so perhaps that's something that you do when it's like your behavior program or whatever. So also keep in mind that as you're looking at all of this, you're not biting this all off in one bite, right? Look at where it makes the most sense to start, prioritize that, and then do that evaluation of start to finish. Can somebody enter my organization and go through the whole process in Spanish? And that may be one Spanish or one non-English, one bilingual staff person, volunteer, contractor that you have. But that may be sufficient for your community. The next slide is a couple of pitfalls that come up all the time. And this is something these are basically for every organization, not just animal welfare. These are some major pitfalls to avoid. Know when to use Google Translate. Google Translate is a tool, and it's a tool that translators use. It's not always bad, and part of it is trying to figure out how critical and how repetitive is the information that I need to give. If this is something that I've had somebody walk in and they're trying to describe something about their animal, can I have Google Translate be a translator on the spot to figure out what their needs are? Absolutely. If you get an email or a Facebook message, totally, Google Translate's fine. You don't have to pay somebody necessarily to tell you what that says. But if you're using Google Translate for your website, if you're using it for your forms, you are probably putting a product out there that communicates to the community that speaks that language that you don't prioritize them enough to have a professional translation done. It is very obvious when something has been Google translated, and Google cannot, no translator, no electronic translator can capture the contextual piece, the culturally contextual pieces. So something may be translated appropriately from a linguistic standpoint, one word into the next word, but it may miss a total a connotation that culturally is a really negative one. And it just cannot pull in and the cultural pieces into that are necessary. So from that, moving there, don't assume that translating the words also translates the cultural context. In some cultures, very direct and literal communication is prioritized. English is one of those languages that leans towards direct and succinct communication. There are other languages, specifically a lot of our Asian languages, a lot of our Latin American languages, where that direct, succinct language can be viewed as rude, it can be viewed as inappropriate. So making sure that you're translating that cultural context as well. Don't hire bilingual staff and then expect them to translate your forms or your documents or your website. Those are two very different skills. Being an interpreter, the interpreter is the spoken word who can, stand there and talk to somebody in two languages. That is a very different set of skills than sitting down and taking words on a page and putting them into the target language. So if you hire a bilingual staff person, unless that person has been specifically trained as a translator as well, they should never, ever, under any circumstances, be translating the very official documents and the presence that you're putting forward on your marketing and your website. So use a professional translating service, whether that's an individual or whether that's a company, but anything that is a document or a print material, you're going to want to use a professional service, and you're going to want to use transcreation. Everybody talks about, well, we're going to translate our website. I would highly recommend you transcreate your website. And basically that means taking the English and putting it into that full cultural context, so that you're essentially recreating it in a way that has the same impact on your non-English readers that your English website has. So that's making sure that you're using images that are appropriate. If you take if your website is primarily a bunch of white faces, and then you copy all of those pictures over onto your other language, and those faces don't look like the people who are reading it, that sends a certain message. Also making sure that if something is idiomatic in English, that it's actually put into an appropriate idiom in that other language. So that transcreation is the idea of putting the same feel into the second language as opposed to just translating the words literally. Also, don't assume that you're the trusted messenger. We as shelters want to always think of ourselves as the trusted place where people come to get information about their pets, but that may not be the case. Again, we talked a little bit earlier about how there may be certain cultural attitudes towards animal shelters. Even in English-speaking communities, there may be certain cultural attitudes towards animal services or municipal or county animal organizations, animal welfare organizations. So don't assume that just because you're suddenly putting everything into the language of your target community, that they're just going to embrace that and say, awesome, we're so glad you finally, are speaking our language. Instead, make sure that you find ambassadors within that community who can be your link to that community. So in some cases, that may be a pastor in a church that is conducted in that language. It may be just an activist who's been working in that community for a long time, but finding somebody that you can work with in that community who can help deliver your message. And again, just because you put your website into that language doesn't mean they're going to, but if you can have a trusted ambassador within that community that community trusts, who can drive people to your website, who can distribute your flyers, or who will be willing to bring people in and sit with them while you work with them, that's a real key part to making sure that all of your language efforts are actually implemented and useful. And then don't just translate it and forget it. Make sure that you have a plan. This should be, part of your general document review plan that you should be doing at least annually, that you're looking at, are policies still the same? Well, if our policies have changed and we changed the English forms, did we change the Spanish forms? did our website get updates that we haven't been translating? Are our program target areas changing? So making sure that whatever you put originally into that target language is getting a little TLC, at least on an annual, if not more regular basis, just like it's happening in your own language. So that is, in the interest of time and of giving time for the breakout groups, that is our presentation for this morning. Again, with the understanding that this really is a jumping off point, and there's a lot more that we can look at and talk about. And if you have any questions about outreach to the communities in your community, please feel free to reach out to Kristen or myself. And if you have specific questions about language and translation and working with translation companies, please feel free at any time to reach out to me as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna and Kristen. That was a great presentation, very informative. We'll go ahead and open it for questions. If you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and then I'll tell everybody them and they can answer them. Doesn't. So has everyone heard of the HSUS Spanish translation for shelters? That's this Kelly. That's one thing Kelly stated, it was that HSUS has a Spanish translation for shelters.
This is Christine. I haven't heard of that before.
She says it is a booklet that can be sent to your shelter.
Oh, is this the little like glossary? Like a little dictionary of animal welfare terms? Because I've seen that before. I think those were handed out at a conference once.
Kelly, do you want to unmute yourself? And you can explain a little more about it.
Yeah, so there's a booklet, and I can't remember if it's free or just steeply discounted, or like you only pay for shipping for your shelter, but it has shelter specific terms. So it goes through euthanasia, behavior. It's very, very specific to us. So it's helped in the past when you're not getting through with Google Translate, or often we'll have like monolingual parents bringing in their bilingual, like young child to translate. And when we're talking euthanasia, when we're talking owner surrender, obviously that's not always appropriate. So you can kind of pull that out, and even just pointing to the word has helped us get our message across, and then they can kind of give it back to us as well. It also has animal law enforcement stuff in there too, so it might be good for those that are kind of doing both sections.
Yeah, and those are, so a glossary like that is really important for, especially when you do have a bilingual staff member, having them study that. That needs to be part of their onboarding and their training, because using appropriate language is really critical. If somebody doesn't have the word for euthanasia and they basically circumlocute it, there's a chance that that person, because they're like, oh, that's a high level word, I don't know how to say that, they might use the word matar, which is to kill, and we don't want that to happen, right? That's why it's so important that these are culturally and linguistically appropriate. So having somebody study something like that is where you would get a lot of the benefit out of that. And the question about how to attract bilingual candidates for hiring, that's that's not just animal welfare, that's everywhere. Our police department is trying to hire bilingual officers, and I think in the last 10 years have hired like 4 or something like that, so it's not easy. But I would come back to that trusted ambassador. How are you recruiting? If you're recruiting where people, or advertising, not just your recruitment, this is kind of in general, but if you're putting your information in the newspaper and you have a Spanish ad in your English newspaper, how useful is that? Because they're not opening that newspaper to begin with to see that ad. Or if you're advertising on the radio and the radio is primarily, it's all English, then how is that helpful? So really looking at where are the places that the people you want to attract consuming their information? If you have those trusted ambassadors within that community, how can you talk to them about, hey, we're looking to hire somebody who speaks the language, of this community. Do you know of anyone who would be great, who would be bilingual? Can you help me get the word out? Can you help me advertise it? None of these cultural groups are a monolith, but they tend to be connected to their community. And that's a cultural thing that happens both from within the community and from without. When there are not services provided in their language, that sort of pushes them into those communities where they can understand each other. So going to where people who speak those languages that you're interested in serving, where they consume their information, and making sure that you're putting that information out for them. And then to Brittany's question about trying to teach an employee Spanish, that's a really complicated question, because you can teach a person Spanish, but that doesn't mean that you're teaching them all of that cultural context, or even, it takes years of immersive learning to get to a point that you're functionally fluent. So you can teach somebody so that they have sort of that basic ability to interact, but my recommendation would always be that if you have a monolingual English speaker that you're teaching Spanish or any other language, that they be the pass-off point and really just be sort of that kind of the level of Google Translate, right? That they're there to figure out what somebody needs, and then they pass that person off to the person who can provide those culturally informed services to them. If you have an employee who has been studying for years and years, honestly, maybe you send them to another country to do a study abroad if you have the resources for that, which I know none of us has that kind of funding or the ability to spare somebody for that long, but really to get somebody to a point that they can have a culturally informed conversation is not going to happen taking a monolingual speaker and then training them in a classroom. And then so suggestions on how to communicate with Spanish speakers when you're unable to attract Spanish speaking employees. Again, that's where if you have that Google Translate as that initial point of entry and the ability to say to somebody, we're going to, you can either have this on a card, or you can have sort of a script written out that you're able to show them that says, I'm going to take your information and we're going to get back to you with somebody who speaks XYZ language. And that's where you might want to reach out to private interpreters and see if they would be willing. You can do, you can have them do a language line kind of thing where you call them, put them on speakerphone, and you can work through that interaction to schedule a subsequent time that they might be able to come in with that person or meet that person there with you. So that would be my not very satisfactory answer. I know that it's not the answer that people want to hear, but really it depends on the message you want to send, right? How much are we prioritizing this? It's either we're super sorry, we can't do this, we don't speak this language, come back with somebody. And that sends a certain message about, the level of priority we're putting on serving that community, or saying, we're going to bring the translator in, we're going to bring the interpreter in, and here's when and how we're going to do that.
And Anna, this is Christine. I've used, the Dumb Friends League does have a service like that, a telephone interpretation service that we use. And I have used that in the community to, I think it was with my patron who spoke Vietnamese, and it worked just fine. It really was a pretty smooth process. As you said, is that you call, you put them on speakerphone, and we were able to get through an entire conversation about how many cats she had and what services they needed. And so that is definitely an option that I think is extremely functional, and that lets you get to, with our particular service, you can communicate in any language. So yeah, that's definitely an option.
Anna has a question. Have you modified your job descriptions at all to make positions more accessible to bilingual candidates, eliminating experience or education requirements?
Yeah, this is one of the conversations in general about diversity, equity, and inclusion right now in general. So if we are if we are prioritizing having diversity in our workforce, and we understand that there are socioeconomic factors or these social determinants that lead to somebody not having as high likelihood of being able to get a certain level of degree or experience, then removing that and having a different way to qualify somebody for the organization is really important. So I would say, Anna, that yes, I think that's a really critical way. If you're looking at, if you want a bilingual person, is the degree is that the qualifier? There's a whole separate conversation about how to determine, is somebody bilingual or not bilingual, right? Like what level of bilingualism, but that's really a critical piece of DEI in general, is making sure that we're not putting arbitrary and onerous requirements in place that automatically pre-filter people who are bilingual, which is an incredible skill, but don't have the degree to back that up.
Christine, can you use that service on the phone? Or do they have to be, I'm at the shelter and somebody call in?
You can definitely use it on the phone. I've used it in live situations where the patron is in front of me, but I know our call center team uses, we use a company or a service called Volgistics. I know our call center team uses that frequently. So while I have not observed them doing that, there must be a way to sort of go back and forth with someone who's on the phone to communicate with them and somehow get a conference call going. So yeah, that you absolutely can do that. But I personally have just done it when someone's in front of me.
Perfect, thank you.
Can I clarify the name of that program? Because Volgistics is a volunteer software. So I wanted to make sure that that we have the right name.
Let's do better. It's Volatia. It's not.
There we go.
Let's try one more time in English to get the words correct. It is Volatia. I'll type that in.
Christine, can you share about your experiencing doing the DFL Spanish language radio show?
Yes, I sure can. So I will first say that to Anna, my co-presenter, everything in your presentation was fabulous and I loved it. I do a lot of your pitfalls essentially. And so let's so in an effort to communicate in any way I can, I think we have occasionally done things that would have been better through someone more experienced in speaking Spanish. That being said, pre-COVID, the Dumb Friends League temporarily had a talk radio program on a Spanish radio station here in Denver on 1150 AM. And I did it along with Gloria Banuelos, who is a groomer at our shelter and a native Spanish speaker. So that probably gave me some accuracy and legitimacy. But basically, we would each week have a topic that we were planning to speak about it in the show with regards to the services that the Dumb Friends League offered. And people could live call in and ask us questions. So sometimes we would talk about, all right, the importance of vaccines. Why are vaccines important? Which vaccines are important? How can I access them? What do they cost? And then of course, we just have tons of information about where you could get these vaccines, and people could call into the show and ask questions live. We also would have guests on the show periodically, like a behavior specialist. We had folks from Denver Animal Shelter, Metro Denver Cat come in, and we always got live calls. So people were certainly listening. I think it was difficult to measure the impact that it had. I certainly enjoyed doing it. It was like a 1-hour program on Monday afternoons. And I think it was a really fun experience, and it gave us an opportunity to interact with the community in a different way. But I think it was difficult to measure impact. And it was stopped at the time of the quarantine when we stopped canvassing and doing things. And we haven't brought it back because I feel like, looking at it, there are probably some better ways we can reach the community, but it was a really fun thing to do. And if there were a different way to gauge its effectiveness, it was really fun, because I thought it was a unique way for people to call in and ask a behavior question, or or ask a low-cost veterinary question. So we love doing it.
And that's a really good example of using the trusted, sort of a trusted ambassador. So, you know, I want to make sure that this, I think the baseline is provide the service, provide the baseline, right? Do whatever you can. If that is a bilingual person who's a, you know, native English speaker who's learning Spanish and isn't quite there yet, that's better than nothing, right? Do what you can, but know that what we just presented is what that's the goal. That's, if you want to look at best practices, if you want to look at doing it in the most culturally informed way and to avoid some of those cultural blunders that could give the impression that, I mean, that if you have if somebody comes in and has a culturally insensitive experience with you, that will make its way through the community as well. So, you know, remembering that every time that somebody comes in to have an interaction with you, if that interaction leaves them with a very bad taste in their mouth, then that will be communicated to the rest of that community. And now you have a much steeper uphill battle to be able to work with that community in the future. So use what you can, but that, what Christine just described, is a really great way of having, of partnering and having a trusted ambassador. If there was somebody on that show who was a native Spanish speaker and was able to relate to the community in a culturally informed way, then that actually, if there are any blunders or mistakes or linguistic mistakes on the part of the native English speaker,
Which I'm sure there were.
And
Which there absolutely were.
But those are definitely more forgivable when that intention is clear, that it's being done in the most sincere way possible, because there's another person there with her who can be that cultural broker.
Absolutely.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to, first of all, my name is Jennifer. I'm with the Riverdale Animal Shelter, and I'm so excited that this session is being held. I think it's so important for all of the organizations here in Colorado to have access and a means to effectively communicate with the Spanish-speaking community. At Riverdale, I wanted to mention that we started our Spanish language outreach probably about 2 to 3 years ago. And now we have 2 native speakers, one from Mexico and one from South America. And we did actively recruit for these 2 positions. And I know one of the questions was, how do you do that effectively? And in the interview process, we made it very clear how important Spanish outreach was to us, so that the people that would fill these positions would feel supported, which I was told later was very important to them, feeling comfortable accepting the position. Especially here in Adams County, where our Spanish-speaking population is at 49%. It's especially important that the 2 people who are on our team feel supported in that once, and just as Anna had mentioned, once the word gets out that there is a means to communicate with the shelter, you know, through Spanish speaking representatives, it's like it comes in waves. I mean, there's a ton of people who call in, and at first we only had 1 person there, and she was getting so many calls a day, so many people just stopping by, expecting immediate access to her. So we immediately hired someone else so that they can support each other. And it's also important for the rest of the team to be able to understand and to communicate with these 2 individuals the cultural sensitivity around a lot of the issues that come up, and to be able to put your heads together and figure out a way to communicate solutions for those individuals. So I just wanted to share that, how important it is to make sure that not only are you putting those individuals in place, that you create a support system that they can lean on and rely upon when there are difficulties, instead of just throwing them into that position and expecting them to just go about their day. They take on a ton of issues throughout the day that they definitely need help with. So I just wanted to add that.
So there was another question, and Jennifer, maybe you can also weigh in on this. I'm curious if you are offering any additional compensation for bilingual employees who speak the language you've identified are a priority in your organization. Do you pay a shift differential or offer other additional compensations for that skill?
I can, yeah, I definitely answer that. At Adams County, diversity and inclusion is one of the top priorities for our executive leadership. So we have a group called Adams Proud, which is A Proud, which works on, it's an employee group that works on diversity policies and such for the county. And as part of that diversity and inclusion, those diversity and inclusion efforts, we did come up with an employee compensation structure for those individuals who do speak Spanish. The way it works is that there is a test that is put on by a translation company, and it does consider, as Anna mentioned, interpretation and being able to speak conversationally are two totally different things. And so the test is based on what that individual would like to test on, whether or not it's by speaking or simply interpreting a translation. Interpreting a translation is highly complex. And so that is why our compensation structure is different depending on which test that those individuals are taking. But yes, Adams County does offer that as part of that.
Anna and Christine, do you have anything to add?
I would just echo that. I think it really has to do with, just as Jennifer said, it has to do with what's the skill level. Because if you're bringing somebody in who's going to do your translations, because they have a background in that and they have tested out of that or into that or whatever, then yes, I think that it's important that they're paid a compensatory amount. But if it's, yes, I think there should also be at least a slight pay differential for somebody who is bringing in a skill that you've listed as important to achieving your mission. So just like if you're hiring somebody for, I don't know, your adoptions team who has a CDT, CDT, certified dog trainer certificate, you're probably, I would assume you're going to be, giving pay that's commensurate with that experience, with that additional credential. Being bilingual, depending on what level of bilingualism you're bringing in, should be looked at similarly as bringing in a skill, just like somebody coming in with or training into any of those animal related skills or the finance skills that you would bring into your finance team. So I'm not sure. That's my short answer, is that yes, there should be a difference if you have a way to measure that, and if you're already doing that for other skills within your personnel plan.
Jennifer, could you share the services that you're using to assess fluency and competence?
In terms of hiring?
Yes.
Because we are relying on our customer care team to converse with the public mostly. We're not asking them at all to provide translation at any level. We actually do hire out an ATA certified translator, as Anna has that same certification. Super important to ensure not only, as Anna mentioned, that they're able to interpret and translate orally as well as on paper, but also to be able to provide the most neutral Spanish across the board. So that's why we work with an ATA translator. In terms of for us we make sure that our customer care team is our native speakers. We don't test them to be sure that they are able to converse in Spanish. I figure if you're applying for this position, then absolutely you know how to speak Spanish. What we do ask though are those cultural questions of what differences do you foresee having to and working with this particular group than you would in the general with the general public. That alone tells me their level of competency in Spanish, and as well as their cultural background, to be able to tell me what those differences are. So I feel like it's kind of a disconnect to ask someone how well they speak Spanish. So, but those cultural competencies and just having a conversation with them about their background tells me what I need to know. So we don't necessarily test them, if that helps.
Thank you. Someone else asked a question. Has anyone had experience in providing ASL or other services for the deaf, hard of hearing community?
So, and Christine responded in the chat, and I echo that. I mean, it depends. So again, it's a matter of assessing what your access points are. If it's somebody who has come, it's a walk-in situation, or they, if they have reached your organization and you're in person with them, then being able to write back and forth is important. In fact, I just had to do this day before yesterday at City Hall with somebody who was confused about a parking ticket. And so being able to just use a pad of paper and write back and forth can be really effective. Most of the communication that you'll have prior to that with a deaf or hard of hearing community member would be written in the first place, right? So obviously you're not going to advertise to your deaf and hard of hearing community on the radio. You're going to do that in print and in writing. So if writing isn't sufficient, then that's a matter of writing on the tab and saying, do you need an interpreter? Is this means of communication not working? Would you prefer we look for an interpreter? Or do you have an interpreter or whatever? So I think that one of the things that's really important in the whole conversation about DEI in general, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is being able to ask that question. And, when somebody asked me recently, well, do you say Latinx or Hispanic or Latino? And my response is ask the person what they want you to refer to them as. And so the same thing here, how do you want me to communicate with you? If somebody comes in and they're fine with the writing back and forth, just double check, is this an appropriate way for us to communicate? And then the same thing, if you have a bilingual person, so especially if you have somebody who's a native English speaker and who's learning second language, making sure that they're asking the question, are you understanding me? Is this sufficient? Do you want me to call somebody else? So part of serving our community is asking them if we're meeting their needs and asking them if we're serving them in a way that is satisfactory to them or that makes them feel like they're being prioritized. So I would just encourage everybody to be able to have that sort of vulnerability to say, is this working? Or is there more that I could be doing? And be open to whatever feedback comes from that.
All right, thank you very much. I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to pass it off to Rachel to finish the remaining of the training.
So thanks everyone so much for joining us today and spending your morning with us. And a special thank you to our presenters for sharing their knowledge with us today. We will be sharing the recording and the slides, so you can look for some information in an upcoming email for that. We do have some upcoming dates for the next couple of coffee and collaborations, August 4th and November 3rd. So we hope you'll save the date for that. And if you have any ideas or topics that are top of mind that you'd like to recommend that we consider for this, feel free to reach out to any member of the collaboration committee and we will put that into the rotation. So once again, just want to thank everyone and I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.